Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm so happy to be here with so many kindred spirits and so many journeyers into the different dimensions of reality in the world. So, very spirited discussions. I've enjoyed everything I've heard so far. I guess I'll reflect on communication, and maybe you could call it the ecology of communication as a way of entering some of the things I'll bring into the discussion. And as already mentioned by Mark in his opening comments, a lot of my work over the last many years has been with Arnae Ness in Oslo. And as you know, Arnae died on the 12th of January, 2 weeks shy of his 97th birthday, which happened to fall on the same day as Mozart's birthday. He considered that one of the most significant things about his own mythology was that he was born on Mozart's birthday. And one of his major areas of focus and one of his passions throughout his life from the time he was a tad was music. And he was especially gifted pianist. And he went to Vienna to study piano performance with one of the leading teachers in the 30s. When he was working on his dissertation, which was on the nature of behavior and science. How do scientists behave in conducting scientific inquiry? And in fact, what is science? And what he discovered as a sort of preparation to his dissertation was that everybody took for granted they knew what science was. It's what we learned in the introductory science texts of our field. And it says, this is what science is, and so on and so on. And it's all this sort of cut and dried, careful definitions and so on. But he said, when you look at what people actually do, you find that it doesn't really quite square with a lot of what is said in these books. Well, there's been a lot of study of these books over the years, and I found that they sort of have these boilerplates in them, and they just keep repeating them, and the students say, oh no, you got to buy a new text this year, another $100. And way back in the 30s, Ness was asked these questions. Can we do an empirical study of science to determine what it is? And of course, one of the obvious things is to look at the behavior of scientists. And so one place at that time was a real hot place to discuss the nature of science, scientific explanation, what is legitimate science, was the Vienna Circle in Vienna. So Ness said, well, I must go to Vienna and spend time discussing with the Vienna Circle, in which, as you know, many of the influential people that laid down the foundations for a lot of our social science studies in North America and the influence of the positivists and so on. So much of it came out of the Vienna Circle, but not all of the people in the Vienna Circle were positivists. In fact, most of them were not. Well, so Ness was one of these people, he seemed to lead a charmed life. He'd go into a place and all of a sudden he was a member of this Vienna Circle discussion group. And his other passion besides music was mountain climbing. Well, Vienna is a good place if you want to go mountain climbing. So he would go mountain climbing, and then he would go with the Vienna Circle. And then he would go to his piano teacher, and he was a student with about 5 or 6 others who were studying concert piano, and this was the top teacher. And then he said, well, part of all of this is discourse, dialogue, discussion. And he began to realize that what he was really interested in relation to the nature of science was communication, and especially nonviolent communication. And part of this went back to his passion in childhood of playing in nature. And he discovered when he was about 7 years old in the fjords of Oslo that he often played alone because his siblings were quite a bit older, you see, and so he was in there alone, and he discovered he could communicate with all these little organisms in the water. So if he was very still and peaceful, they would all come around and they'd explore his body and they'd hide under his feet and do all these things. And then if he'd get agitated, they'd disappear. And so he'd experiment, you see. Let's do a little experiment here. I'll move my foot, see what happens. I'll stand very still. I'll think I have nasty thoughts. And that was, in a way, the beginning of his lifelong pursuit of trying to understand communication. So really, Ness's first major work was called Interpretation and Preciseness. The first full-scale book was published in '53, but the research actually goes back to the 30s and his opening discussions with the Vienna Circle, which then led, after he finished his doctorate, to a postdoc fellowship in research, psychology, learning theory in Berkeley. And he was then invited by E.C. Tolman, the great learning theorist and experimental psychologist, to come to Berkeley, and he gave him his own lab and set him up as an official research associate. And asked him if he would become a research associate professor. And so Ness was telling me, he said, well, I went to Berkeley. He said that was a fabulous place, and especially the beaches were wonderful. Because, you know, having lived in Norway, it's quite different from California. And so he did all these rat studies and learning theory and mazes and all these kinds of things. And then he said, I began to see that the rats were pretty smart. In fact, they could tolerate more choices than humans. And they said after a while, I began to say, well, this is not so interesting studying the rats, and it's too bad anyway, because they're tied up and they can't do anything interesting, you see. They're all in these little cages. And they didn't like that. And he said, also, even though these rats had been bred in captivity for generations to be cooperative in the laboratory, if they got loose in the lab at night, the next day you'd come in and you couldn't handle them. They were violent and wild and attack you. And he said, okay, so if I don't want to study rats, what should I study? Psychologists study rats. So that was the beginning of studying a psychologist studying rats. And so Tolman called him into his office. He says, Professor Ness. He said, what are you doing? He said, he explained to him what he's doing. And Tolman sat back and he thought about that. And he said, that's a very good idea. He said, go ahead, keep doing that. And then he called him in his office another day and he says, Professor Ness, I understand that you and your family are camped in a tent over in the park. He said, yeah, that's right. He says, well, you can't do that. He said, no, we're very experienced. We know how to do that. No, he said, you don't understand. He said, you're a professor. Professors don't do that. You must get an apartment. Well, so how is this all related to the ecology of communication? Well, these studies led him then to ask questions that philosophers thought they knew the answers to, and that's you know, the academics thought they knew the answers to, such as, ordinary people mean this by such and such terminology. You know, ordinary people think this. And so he started asking professors, he said, how do you know what ordinary people think? Have you done any research? Have you done any study? Well, no, but everybody knows, you know. And so he said, well, maybe we don't know. Maybe we should start doing some kind of research and, you know, find out. Well, of course, what he found out when he started doing research on things like freedom, democracy, God, and so on, was that ordinary people thought as many different things about these as the so-called experts. And in fact, the so-called ordinary people had more ideas than the academics. And so that was the beginning then of the School of Empirical Semantics, which he started in Oslo. And they did all kinds of studies for the UNESCO and so on. And the whole idea behind it, ultimately for him, was a commitment to nonviolent communication.